When we consider this question of what history has done for education, we're brought to two different areas of inquiry which relate to one another but which are quite separate. The first is the traditional answer that in order to become an educator, we must know something about the history of education. We need to know where our professional, cultural, intellectual and academic roots lie. We need to know that we're drawing on traditions that are as old as Greek philosophy, the Hebrew Bible, and indeed more recently the changes and innovations that have produced the education system with which we are familiar as teachers. And you can think about that question in the most practical of terms. Where did the vocabulary of education come from? Schools, classrooms, groups, setting, intelligence, attainment, knowledge. Where did practices like raising hands in a classroom in order to answer a question, the physical punishment of children, the decision that some learning is better done outside of the classroom walls than inside, the creation of spaces like playgrounds or dining halls. These questions are not simply of antiquarian or forensic interest. We ask them because in answering them, we will understand better where we have come from as educationalists, as theorists, as practitioners in our relationships with children and young people. In other words, to be informed and confident professionals, we place ourselves at the centre of an historical tradition. Now, this has been a source of educational interest and indeed educational authority for many thinkers. The great neglected philosopher of education, Giambattista Vico, an Italian, an 18th century Italian thinker, he argued that without understanding the traditions of education, the genealogy, the pedigree of education, no teacher could fully understand their task or the work they were discharged to do. More abstractly, though very politically, of course, another source of answers to this particular question is to say that the history of education is also the history of the nations and communities in which education is embedded. There is a very live debate in contemporary, shall we say, post-referendum Scotland about the nature and distinctiveness of Scottish education and how far that distinctiveness should be actively taught to those who are going to become teachers or leaders within that system. In some ways, the British educational systems are among the least nationalistic in terms of the place of history in the formation of those who will be responsible for educating children and young people in schools. Other systems are much more nationalistic in outlining and passing on to the next generation of teachers a clear national or community narrative about why we are here, where we come from, and what parts of that heritage and that tradition it is our duty to pass on. Relatedly, perhaps, there are other kinds of communities. There are religious communities, ethnic communities, regional, linguistic groups, all wishing to assert that they have distinctive educational practices and legacies from which the current generation at any given time must learn, and which it is the duty of the institutions and authorities to renew generation upon generation. Think of something like Catholic education, which is as old as Christianity itself, and which is still an extraordinarily live force in international global education. Think in Scotland of Gaelic medium education, the creation of a system designed to deliver the whole curriculum in a minority language which historically was repressed, marginalised and forbidden, and which has come back with such vigour and promise in the 20th and 21st centuries. So what we see here are layerings in the history of education which have traction, they have purchase on the practices that we pursue as teachers today. There is, however, a whole other dimension to this question of what history does for education, what history does for educators. And that is a more generalised question. If teachers of whatever discipline, primary education, mathematics, chemistry, technological studies, English literature, if they are to be fully confident and mature professionals, then some authorities argue very assertively it is important that they are historically literate. And this is about more than simply understanding the history of their professional practices or the history of education. This is about identifying certain major themes, narratives, experiences of which every practitioner should be aware in order to function as a public intellectual, because teachers are that, and as a public servant, as someone accountable to the public for the education of the next generation, and standing once again within a tradition of learning and inquiry. There's a crude version of this which says that if you wish to be a teacher of technological studies, for example, then you ought to be aware of the history of the Industrial Revolution and of the massive technological changes and transformations that have taken place in British society in the last 200 years. In order to be an effective teacher of mathematics, then you ought to be aware of the history of mathematics and the great breakthroughs that have been made by other civilizations and by our own in coming to understand the universe mathematically and in embedding the tools of mathematical learning in other practices of our economic and cultural life. This is a more controversial area because, of course, it leads to a very difficult set of choices. Well, which history? What history should we be studying? It was very common in Scottish schools in the 1950s and 60s to study aspects of the national Scottish past as part of the heritage and tradition that had to be communicated in schools. That in itself, though, was a highly selective past. Let me offer one example. In the major cities, the legacy, economic and cultural, of those who had made their wealth out of the tobacco and cotton trades in Glasgow in the 17th and 18th centuries were very lavishly celebrated in the curriculum. They were commonly known as the tobacco lords. In the 1970s, as Scottish and British society began to change under the impact of immigration from its former colonies and Commonwealth countries, questions started to be asked about these tobacco lords and cotton barons, who were in fact either directly or indirectly implicated in the Atlantic slave trade, in the enslavement of millions of black people and their expropriation from Africa to the Caribbean and mainland America in order to serve as slaves in the plantations that produced cotton and tobacco. So in the last 30 years there's been a revolution in our understanding of how this particular narrative should be taught in our schools, and probably most teachers today entering teacher education programmes would have a very clear awareness of the Atlantic slave trade, of the Shoah, the Holocaust of the Jewish people in the Second World War, of the narrative of 20th century conflict from 1914 to the Cold War. There would be, in other words, a bedrock of historical knowledge that is part of the curriculum in schools and that figures in the education of teachers, not merely as teachers, but as citizens. Now this brings us to a third theme, which arises out of the other two, and that is what is learned from the study of the past. If any one of you is to be placed on the spot and asked by a pupil, why are we studying the Vikings? Why are we studying the Romans? Why are we studying the Scottish Wars of Independence? Why are we studying the Second World War? Then there has to be an answer to those questions. There has to be a response that makes educational and also historical sense. In the last generation, the vocabulary that has been used to convince the population of the merits of studying history, convince the politicians and decision makers of the merits of funding the study of history in education, has been essentially one of citizenship. That in order to function effectively as confident, autonomous, self-regulating citizens, able to make free choices on everything from career and lifestyle to political and election options, that the study of the past informs all of these processes. In becoming, in other words, an active, fully functioning, flourishing citizen, that citizen has to be rooted in a narrative and an experience of the past. Or we can take that further and pluralise it. That citizen needs to be rooted in a number of narratives and experiences, rooted in a broad spectrum of pasts, because these narratives and experiences are often conflicted, they're often sources of dispute and debate and controversy, and it is part of democratic learning and active participation in society, as something like Curriculum for Excellence envisages it, that individuals will inhabit those debates, take part in those debates, and then arrive at their own judgments and determinations on the basis of those debates. We can think of a whole spectrum of questions, ranging from the political choices we make, the understanding of cultural diversity, the understanding of gender relations, the changing patterns of employment and career, the pathways onto further and higher education that emerge from school. And we can easily recognise, I think, that active, happy, flourishing, confident citizens and learners can only gain from a kind of historical literacy in understanding the pedigree and background to the institutions, practices and sensations that inscribe everyday life as we mature into adult society. Historically, the argument for citizenship has been seen as a kind of instrumental one. And this is important because history as a subject has to compete on the curriculum with a whole range of other disciplines. And of course, there are some authorities, and you'll find this in many of the standard bibliographies, who argue quite simply that if you wish to teach citizenship, teach citizenship. Don't use other vehicles like history or geography or modern studies to do it. Simply offer people opportunities to be effective, reflective citizens and dispense with all this unnecessary baggage and expensive baggage. In other words, there might be more effective topics and themes to study than historical ones that will ensure that you're more employable, that you're more confident, that you're more literate and numerate, and that you have a wider range of options placed before you. In the last 40 years, there have been 2 or 3 moments, let me suggest, where the study of history in the curriculum has actually been under threat when subjected to these measures. It gives rise, I think, to a final, more philosophical set of considerations. And these are perhaps well crystallised in this year of 2014 where I'm speaking. Because in 2014 we are commemorating, remembering, reflecting upon the major anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War, 1914 to 1918. Let's subject that to that same naive pupil question: why, sir, miss, are we studying the First World War? It happened 100 years ago. On the basis of the issues in which we've touched here in this reflection, you will see there are a number of possible answers to that. The most obvious one would be, well, because that experience was so large scale, so transformative, made such an impact on our culture and our civilization, locally, nationally, globally, it is essential that we understand it, because its legacy is all around us. Yes, the last few living people with any first-hand acquaintance with that conflict are passing away. Even those who were children and infants during that conflict are now passing away. But as their individual memories disappear from our cultural record, so ever more importantly does cultural memory loom large as a, let me suggest, a moral and ethical responsibility of society. We are remembering the First World War in 2014 in order to understand ourselves and the world in which we live better, in order to reflect upon the choices we will have as members of the society that is the inheritor of that war and everything in the 20th century that came from that war. This is a more abstract and elusive justification for history and for what it contributes to the life of the mind, to the examined and reflective life. In my estimation, it is the most important of all the justifications. The living memory of the past informing the experience of the present. And when we approach the study of the past, the impact of the past in our professional formation as educators, whether we're going to teach in nurseries and kindergartens, in primary and secondary schools, or in highly specialised zones of particular educational need, we may forget about history, as the great Frederick Jameson once remarked, but history will not forget about us.